Amnesia is an iconic horror series from publisher Frictional Games. With the latest in the series releasing, I strapped on a pair of my best diapies and put my sanity on the line to take a look back at the franchise that's been scaring the duke out of me for the last decade. So has it managed to stay at the top of the game after all these years? Let's turn out the lights, slap on those cans, and find out. So Amnesia has a really special place in my heart since back in 2010 with the original release of The Dark Descent. I don't remember exactly how I heard about the game, but I knew it had a reputation for being one of the scariest games out there. And for me, well, I didn't really do too well with horror back then. I was one of those kids that would stay up staring at the clothes in my closet because they looked like they might have a shape. Or if I had to head downstairs at night, I'd daisy chain lights all the way down to make sure I was never in the dark. I was absolutely terrified of the dark and the supernatural, which stemmed from a viewing of The Ring when I was almost 10. Honestly, if it wasn't for my sweet dude Bandit sleeping in my bed, I honestly don't know how I would have gotten through a lot of those nights. And while horror is one of my favorite genres today, I still haven't rewatched The Ring just based on that first viewing. But why is that important when talking about Amnesia? Well, I was 17 when it came out and still struggling quite a bit with being what some might call a scaredy cat. So my friends and I would hang out on the weekends and try and play through as much of it as we could with the lights off. And it was honestly so fun. No over-the-top disingenuous screaming, just real scares, yelling, and laughs. And we never actually managed to finish it, but eventually I forced myself to get through it on my own, daring myself to venture deeper in the darkness and cower around those big scary naked dudes and their big scary buns. And it opened me up to a whole world of spooky experiences I previously was avoiding. The idea that I was making it through this horrifying game that plenty of other people couldn't or just wouldn't really appealed to me and maybe made me feel a little more brave than I know myself to be. And for really giving me the first taste of how fun a healthy dose of fear can be, I'll always be grateful that this series made its entrance when it did. So what exactly makes the Amnesia series so scary? Well, each game starts about the same. You wake up as someone that has recently lost all their memories, and you have to figure out what to do next through exploration and piece together what's going on and why the main character you play as is a top-tier butthole. All the while building up this harrowing atmosphere that primes you to get scared by every little spooky noise. And maybe the most important aspect in every Amnesia game is the relationship the player has with the dark. And this ain't your daddy's darkness. This is a real deep, only see a few feet in front of your face kind of dark. The kind that'll drive you to the brink of insanity if you forget to plug in your nightlight. But you do get some tools to help you push back the darkness. Although aside from Machine for Pigs, these are only temporary. And so if you end up using too much because you got scared, then you're going to be terrified when you're crawling around on the ground with your eyes wide trying to absorb as much light as you can into your dumb pupils. There's also various monsters in each game which move around the map, and using their skills of perception will notice a dude holding a bright ass light in the abyssal darkness. So it's a really delicate balance between staying alive and staying sane. And so to really sum it up, Amnesia really excels at teasing you with the possibility of something scary, that you end up scaring yourself just walking around in an empty map. And then when they finally drop a monster on you, it's extremely effective. Outside the scares, Amnesia also has some pretty unique gameplay thanks to Frictional's own HPL engine. This thing is heavily physics-based, but the main thing you should know is that interactions with world objects, like opening a door, pulling a switch, or turning a wheel, all need to be mimicked by your mouse movements. You can pick up most items and then stack, rotate, or throw them. But the real reason to do this is to find resources in the world which are usually cleverly hidden in boxes, in drawers, or maybe under something you have to move. And beyond that, you'll find countless notes. And I mean, these things are absolutely everywhere. As if some dinghole's walking around with a stack of paper writing whatever comes to his mind, and then just dropping that bad boy where they're standing. And to me, it's one of the big downsides of the entire series. Because if you aren't so into reading notes that you find in the game, then you aren't going to have any clue what's going on. Sure, there's a lot of environmental storytelling, but a lot of those environments and the things you're doing aren't going to be as effective or make as much sense unless you're seeking out the story yourself. But I've also got to say, during my latest playthroughs, I read every note I found and still didn't really get what was going on. So here's a quick breakdown of what you need to know. There are a number of magical orbs which can be used to perform some magic mumbo-jumbo, but the important thing to know about them is that if they aren't used correctly, something called the Shadow ends up chasing you after putting its gross red flesh all over the place like a disgusting cosmic slug. These things also seem to have the power to keep things alive, although again there's some hand-wavy magics and alchemy going on in this universe. So I'll just say, if you have any questions about how or why anything in this universe is working, the best answer is going to be, just don't think about it too much. Or a different answer I can give you, that I personally live by, is, just check the wiki. While I feel my game only gave me the abridged Cliff Notes version of the story, I guess someone out there got a peek of the full thing. And who knows, maybe it's ironic that I found myself so completely in the dark when it comes to the story of Amnesia, or maybe it's not. I honestly have no clue. I'm just now finding out my reading comprehension is on the same level as a tiny-brained child. And with that out of the way, let's talk specifics. Specifically, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. The Dark Descent is the first game in the Amnesia series, developed by Frictional Games and seeing its initial release on PC in September 2010, followed by release on the PS4, Xbox One, and even the Nintendo Switch spread out over the next decade. And let me tell you, if you're porting your game 9 years later for a new console, then you've probably done something right. In this one you play as Daniel, who's a guy who found an orb while on an excavation trip in Algeria. And after breaking it in one Butterfinger-filled night, he finds himself chased by the Shadow. He eventually moves in with the worst roomie of all time, Alexander von Brennenburg, who is secretly the kind of dude to get naked in the middle of the night and perform some kind of deviant ritual. And I don't know who this guy learned the mystic arts from, but I think someone might have lied to him when they said that pants were optional. Because if I had the ability to open a portal, I don't think the lack of a constant breeze on my buns and balls is going to be what throws me off. And I've got to say, Daniel shouldn't be surprised at all, because that is exactly the kind of vibe this guy's giving off. So Daniel ends up getting sucked into this stuff and pretty quickly finds himself torturing and killing humans to extract a substance called vitae, which is generated from their fear. This vitae is then used to keep the Shadow at bay, but it doesn't work forever, and eventually Daniel figures out he's being played by Alexander and decides to put a stop to the whole thing the best way he knows how, by giving himself full-blown amnesia.
I must stop him. Focus.
Daniel wakes up in the dark, and like the player, he has no clue what's going on. And this first section sort of acts as a tutorial for all the game's systems. In this one you got two different sort of health bars, one being an actual health bar, and the other tracking your current sanity levels. And in the Dark Descent, I would argue that the second bar is many times more important than the former, because if your sanity drops too low, it directly affects your experience controlling this guy. In order to avoid losing your sanity, you need to make sure to stay in the light as much as you can and not look at spooky stuff. To help you light up the levels, you have a lantern which runs on oil which can be found around the map, and tinder boxes which are a single-use item that can light a light source like a candle. But here's the thing. Now, it might be that this was my third time playing through this game since its release, but I felt like I was never in danger of running out of oil for my lantern, and certainly not the tinder boxes. I think I had like 50 of these by the end of the game, and just started lighting stuff up because I could. And even then, I just think they aren't really worth using unless you find yourself in a puzzle room. For me, the whole resource management aspect just didn't really add all that much, which is something that I feel they mostly fixed with Rebirth, but I'll touch on that later. I will say that if you haven't played this game before and are moving really slowly through the maps, always keeping your lantern up, it's going to be a different story, and you'll absolutely find yourself in the situation where you need to rely on your tinder boxes. I also want to mention that when starting a new game, you can choose between normal and hard difficulties. I played on normal, so perhaps this isn't even a problem on hard. Now, the actual meat of the gameplay revolves around collecting items from various places in Castle Brennenburg to complete puzzles. The castle consists of multiple hub areas with smaller areas branching from them. Each area usually needs to be visited to grab an item, or do a little physics puzzle before you return back to the hub area and head into the next one. But that gameplay loop ends up being really compelling here just because each time you leave the safety of the hub area, you're thrust right back into the dangerous dark, and your only option is to explore the area all the while knowing one of these monsters might be around any corner or behind any door. And I can't even explain how scary it is being chased by one of these guys. Once you finally find some safety, it's almost easier to go insane sitting in the dark corner than to venture back out knowing there's something else moving around out there. And the monsters in this game are super creepy. They have this grotesque body horror design going on, and the way they move around along with the noises they make ends up putting them in nightmare-fueled territory. And even just looking at them for a short amount of time will drop your sanity like a sack of potatoes. And honestly, I think the balance of scares to exploration to action set pieces is almost perfect in the Dark Descent. Like I said before, Frictional really knows how to let the atmosphere do the heavy lifting, and with that in mind, I've got to say their level design really impressed me here. Sure, the castle looks a bit dated, about 200 years old I think, but there are a lot of really memorable areas that don't make it feel like you're having the same encounters over and over. And by the time you start getting towards the end of the 6-hour campaign, you feel almost mentally exhausted. Maybe not so much as our boy Daniel, but it definitely takes a toll. Later in the story, there's also sort of a well-hidden side quest.
A tonic to free me from this husk of mine.
And I don't mean the quest is hidden, because it's almost impossible to ignore this fish-mouthed noodle man. But just that the quest is so painfully obtuse. It feels almost like a fetch quest with how many weird steps you need to go through just to get all the items together. And then after that, you actually need to know when and where to use those items. Like, I jumped through all the hoops, it took me forever, and at the very end of the game when you're carrying around Mr. Noodle's head, I didn't realize he had to cast that thing into the portal. Maybe I was distracted locking eyes with Alexander's third eye, or maybe this sort of business should be reserved for a second playthrough with the game facts pulled up on your second monitor. And I don't really know what else to say. I really love the Dark Descent. It might be the nostalgia talking, but this is probably my favorite Amnesia out of the 3 main games. It's not quite as cinematic as some of the later entries, but for a game that just turned 10, it holds up exceptionally well and still brings some big scares. And the best thing is, there's a lot more to this package, starting with its small expansion, Justine. Justine was released about a half a year after The Dark Descent and delivered a brand new standalone story. Except this one takes on the form of a linear experience with a permadeath mechanic. And unfortunately, I've got to say, this one didn't do it as much for me. So you play as the titular Justine as she makes her way through a cabinet of perturbation, whatever freaky thing that means. And like the base game, you wake up having no recollection of what's going on, but then you get caught up on the story through phonographs and notes. So in Justine, the goal is to get through the entire cabinet without being killed by one of the 3 suitors patrolling it, all the while deciding the fate of 3 different people trapped in the cabinet. For all 3, just killing them is the path of least resistance, but there's also a slightly harder way that you can save them if you want to spend the time to figure it out. And those choices slightly affect the ending you get, but it's so short and you have no investment in any of these people that I pretty much only saw the various endings for that sweet achievement clout. I think for a first playthrough, you're looking at maybe 45 minutes if you're cruising at a snail's pace, but once you figure out how to actually get through any section, the next time you're there, you're just going to blow right through it because despite Justine having this permadeath mechanic, the cabinet never changes. It always has the same notes and items in the same exact place. You'd think they would have built some procedural content to complement the death mechanic, but there's just nothing. I think it would have been so much better even if the level didn't change, but the items were moved around because after the first run, you'll never even glance towards any of the extra rooms or hallways because you know there's nothing to see there. It's a weird design choice, and it feels like the permadeath was meant to help pad out a short experience. And I feel even more that way because it's not even very well implemented into the game. If you die, the whole application literally shuts down and you need to relaunch it. It makes it feel tacked on, and in my opinion, it just really doesn't add any value, and honestly, it might even detract from the experience. I also think Justine has a bit of a difficulty problem where it's pretty much baby easy through the first 2 trials, and then all of a sudden spikes right at the end. Which wouldn't be much of a problem if you didn't need to play through all the increasingly boring bits, just have this bloodhound suitor sniff you out up on the rafters. And this last section is definitely the most intense encounter in the whole game, taking place in a series of flooded rooms with the suitor busting through every door you drop in his face while you scramble to solve whatever puzzles in the area. It's super cool, and I guess the one thing I'll say about the death system is it kept this section absolutely nerve-wracking, knowing that finding myself trapped would mean another 5 to 10 minutes down the tubes. So Justine is definitely worth checking out after you finish with The Dark Descent. I wouldn't have recommended buying it back in the day, but since it's now included with a base game, the only hurdle is actually figuring out where the hell to launch this thing. It's almost like they're trying to hide it. And again, the best thing is that still isn't everything, because The Dark Descent's HPL engine supports community mods called Custom Stories. Custom Stories are exactly what they sound like. Brand new experiences that big fans of Amnesia have put a whole buttload of their free time into. I'm not exactly sure what all is available to modders, but it seems like they can make custom maps, use existing or imported assets, and create their own unique puzzles and encounters using a language called AngelScript. And from a quick search, the documentation honestly looks pretty great, which goes a long way in getting more people creating. But really what this means is that these custom stories can pretty easily deliver content that is at or near the level of the base game. And I'm not just talking about little 10-minute maps, but pretty much entire new quality campaigns. And all you have to do to check these out is download the mod and stick it into the custom stories directory. Then you can launch it directly from the main menu. It almost brings a tear to my eye to see how involved the community is in this game, with almost 1,000 mods listed on ModDB and new ones still being put out. Now sure, I wish there was a Steamworks integration to make finding and installing new custom stories even easier, but everyone knows not all dreams come true. And that finally rounds out everything I have to say about The Dark Descent. This is a true horror classic that just keeps on giving and giving. Sure, its expansion didn't deliver the same quality, but the huge community of story crafters will give you about as much Amnesia content as you can physically and mentally handle. It was such a huge success, I bet you're thinking Frictional Games was stoked to get started on the next entry. That's partially true, but the result really wasn't what people were expecting. While Frictional went on to make further development into a new version of the HPL engine, which would be used to craft their incredible existential horror project Soma, they hatched a plan with developer The Chinese Room to produce another Amnesia sequel, which would eventually become Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs. A Machine for Pigs was released almost exactly 3 years after The Dark Descent in September 2013 for PC, and like the original has seen re-releases on modern consoles. In A Machine for Pigs, you play as Oswald Mandis, the owner of the Mandis Processing Company. And during a trip to Mexico, he finds an orb, and after seeing the horrors which awaits the world in the coming years, he kills his 2 children and ends up splitting his soul in twine after he breaks the orb. He ends up getting a nasty illness, and over the next months he returns to London and somehow manages to secretly build the most extra factory ever conceived, all the while not being aware of what he's doing, Ben Affleck's Paycheck style. And I mean, this dude's lucky he didn't collapse half of London with how cavernous the bottom areas of this machine are. Like, if the stanky pigman didn't kill all the townfolk, I think it's safe to say that a horrible sinkhole-related death was most likely in their cards. And again, no one should have been surprised. I mean, one look at this logo and I can tell you it's a cult. If you still get turned into a dirty pigment after seeing all the signs, then you really only have yourself to blame. So after many months, our main man Mandus regains consciousness and is tricked by the other half of his soul to start up the machine he's been building. And the thing is, A Machine for Pigs is like the weird stepchild of the Amnesia series, but the settings and general story might be the strongest of the three, even if it's lacking in other areas. I just love the idea of this huge machine which this town is thriving around is meant for carrying out human sacrifices on a massive scale. It's really compelling because from the start you're constantly going deeper and deeper into this massive machine, and you see the horrors of what the machine actually is. You aren't just reading notes left behind detailing what bad stuff happened, and of course you also do that, but you're seeing it with your own eyes. And it's horror that's much more in the realm of the evil side of human nature, even more so than the original with all the torturing. In this one, Mandus tricks orphans into cleaning his machine using the finest of sausages. He donates a whole church which is then used to send full congregations down into the machine. It's all just pure evil stuff that's being done because Mandus thinks he'll help humanity not suffer from what he saw in his vision. That mixed with the existential dread of knowing the pigmen roaming around the factory were once humans that were cut apart and then had their body parts replaced with pig parts. I don't know. It just speaks to me. Now, the reason this isn't my favorite of the three comes down to some weird choices that were made by the devs. So in this one, you also have a lantern to help you with the darkness, but I guess since it's electric, it never runs out. You don't have to crank this thing to charge it or replace its batteries. Nothing. It's just always there if you need it. And it means you never actually have to be scared of the dark. That means tinderboxes were also completely removed from the game. And that's kind of the biggest problem. The Chinese room just completely tore out a lot of systems that made Amnesia work. Remember needing to worry about your sanity? Well, don't worry. It's gone. Sit in the dark and look at these man-pigs man-buns as long as you want. Remember needing to gather healing items to keep your health bar up? Nope. You've got regenerating health, so you've never actually got to worry about taking damage. You like the inventory system? Well, that's completely gone. Instead, just carry puzzle items right in front of your face wherever they need to go. I've just never seen a sequel remove so much of the identity of the original, and I can live without the inventory, but whoever suggested giving the player infinite light and removing the sanity system should have been exiled from the project and forced to wear a dunce cap for the rest of development. I mean, come on, you have a winning formula. You're using the same exact engine. You just have to build the game and maybe try your hand at, I don't know, developing and enhancing those systems. It really doesn't sit right with me, and it's so disappointing to think of what this game could have been. The monsters are still well designed, and the atmosphere is amazing. There are a few really great set-piece moments, but it's just not very scary, which is maybe the worst thing you can say about a follow-up to The Dark Descent. This one's also fairly short, coming in around 3 hours, and it doesn't support custom stories. But even with all the negatives, I personally think A Machine for Pigs is worth picking up and playing. The problem I see with this one is it's living in the shadow of its predecessor, but when looked at in a vacuum, it delivers a really cool experience even if it's not without flaws. And after that little experiment, Amnesia wouldn't see a new entry for another 7 years. But when Amnesia Rebirth was announced in early 2020, it was hard not to get excited seeing that the series had finally made its way back home. Amnesia Rebirth was developed by Frictional Games and released in October 2020 for PC and the PS4. This one runs on an updated version of the HPL3 engine, which was also used on Soma, and in a lot of ways, it's a solid return to its roots. In Rebirth, you play as Tazi Trianon, a French archaeologist whose plane crashes in the deserts of Algeria. She wakes up alone in the plane with no memories of what happened to the crew, or what the goofy timepiece on her arm is. Right away you're greeted with the classic physics-based interactions we've all come to love, but you'll also find that the inventory system has made a triumphant return. Upon leaving the plane, you find yourself stranded in the desert, but quickly you start to piece things together as you follow the trail left behind by your party. But I think a little warning is needed with Rebirth, because these starting hours are very slow. The pacing's a mess with constant flashbacks breaking your immersion in the world, and it can feel like every couple steps you're getting stopped to get a bit of exposition against your will. And with a note you're choosing to read it, but taking away control from the player for a 12-second scene with a single image on screen just feels like the wrong way to deliver the story. They very recently patched these to allow players to skip them, and I can admit that's a step in the right direction, especially for people wanting to go in for a second playthrough or get into speedrunning the game. I even think there are moments of greatness early on, moving through these dark caves and using the locket on your arm to move through rifts and eventually getting a cinematic reveal that you're traveling between Earth and a dead alien world. I just really love the idea, and as someone who just played the last 2 entries, I could really appreciate how Frictional wanted to flesh out the lore in this universe. And while these areas are super cool, I think Rebirth doesn't start hitting its stride until about an hour and a half in, after you've been moving through the first puzzle hub in the game, which is this big fortress in the desert. This one has you moving through different buildings, collecting items to create a shell that you can then use to blow open a big old door, and it's classic Amnesia. so smartly using the level design to put the player on edge. And one thing I've got to give to Frictional is that they really put the time into redesigning the sanity and resource management systems. And for me, this is hands down the best version. Early on, it's revealed that Tazi is struggling with some kind of sickness, and the only way to keep it under control is by keeping her fear levels down. So staying in the dark for too long will raise those fear levels, which is shown by these little vines on the edge of your screen. Even later on, you find out Tazi is actually pregnant and getting more pregnant by the second. And it adds another pretty good reason to try and keep your sickness at bay. Although I don't really think the baby aspect hits as hard as the developers might have wanted it to. I wasn't especially attached to this gross baby growing so fast. I mean, I've never seen a baby grow at that speed, unless that thing comes out hideous with some wings and fangs or something. So for me, the baby was just a way to keep my fear under control. At certain points, you get a prompt to check your tum, and it'll lower your fear levels. So at worst, she's a disgusting mutant.
I don't like this.
And at best, she's an in-house Valium factory. Rebirth also does the same kind of thing that Hellblade's Sinuous Sacrifice does, by hinting that not keeping your fear under control will have lasting effects on Tazi, the baby, and the outcome of the story. The first time I was caught by one of these Dementors floating around the other world, I was genuinely worried after I found out that you don't just get a normal game over screen, you watch Tazi lose control, and then when you come back, the textures on her model look much worse. Her veins are popping out and turning black, and it changed the way I played the rest of the game. And when I say lose control, what I mean is she starts turning into a ghoul, which are the main monsters in the first half of the game. Essentially, these are people that have been infected by drinking some spiked water, and then slowly lose themselves while their bodies stretch out. Because everyone knows the first lesson in Horror 101 is that limbs that are longer than normal are about as scary as it gets. And they are scary. I mean, there's a section where you're moving through a nest of these things, and it's so dang intense. One of my other favorite sections is this super dark labyrinth where one of your crewmates, Leon, who at this point has pretty much completely turned, is trying to hunt you down. So you're trying to juggle staying in control of your fear by lighting matches, and then taking the hit when Leon's around, all the while solving this puzzle which you can barely see. It might even be my favorite encounter out of the 3 games, and to me is the perfect example of what makes this series so special. It's that delicate balance and the sheer terror of watching your match burn down knowing you're about to be plunged back into the maddening darkness. And the new match system is just genius. Instead of tinderboxes, Tazi can collect up to 10 matches by exploring the levels. Instead of being able to just light a single light source, you actually light the match and carry it around for a few seconds before it burns out. During that time you can light as many torches as you can reach, but if you move too fast the match will go out. I really can't praise this system enough, and while it's a bit weird you're capped at 10 matches, I understand it's probably done for balancing reasons. That being said, once you pick up Rebirth's version of the lantern, you can pretty much forget about the match mechanic, because even though this one brings back the need to collect oil to fill the lantern, there's so much around the maps that it's a pretty rare occurrence you'll run dry and need to pull out your matchbook. But on either end of the campaign there are sections where you don't have the lantern, and it can make it really hard to push yourself through the next area. You might start out with 10 matches, but if you're struggling with your fear in some of these later areas, you're going to find yourself reaching for an empty matchbook faster than you might realize. And when that happens, there's this feeling of dread that just washes over you. I guess what I'm saying is that the sanity system is implemented really well here. And while I think there are less scares spread over the campaign, I think the gameplay is the most fun and polished in Rebirth as it's ever been. The levels, puzzles, and art direction are all pretty great, with the biggest exception being this stupid puzzle where you have to turn these obelisks and match them with this wall, and then run back to a different platform to enter a code. And I don't know if I missed something, but eventually I had to admit defeat and just start trying every possible combination. I also kind of found myself getting bored of some of the later sections on the Dead World. And I think it's because worlds that have ended are interesting at a glance. Like, you can only walk around a busted up area made of so many different shades of black for so long before it stops being riveting. And beyond that, I just think they could have done so much more with this idea of the Traveler's Locket. I found myself thinking about all these amazing moments in games like Dead Space 2 where you revisit the Ishimura, or Bioshock Infinite where you make a return to Rapture. And I was kind of thinking that's where Rebirth was headed, because moving across worlds and dimensions gives you about as much creative freedom as you could ever have. I would have loved to find myself back at Castle Brennenburg or in London, even if it's just for a short little excursion. And sure, it's a little fan servicey, but I don't know what to say. I'm a fan, and I love being serviced. And before I give some of my last thoughts on Rebirth, I want to talk a little bit about a few different things I've been seeing brought up a lot. The first being the jump scares we get when Tazi's fear levels get too high. And for some reason, people really hate these things. So much so that Frictional ended up hearing the outrage and toned them down in a post-launch patch. And I just really don't get it. Sure, they aren't like the highest caliber of scares, but I didn't feel like they were as cheap as jump scares you get in other games either. Honestly, I didn't think anything of them, and probably wouldn't have even mentioned if I hadn't seen the comments from people saying they were ruining the game. Now, the devs have said these weren't ever meant to be jump scares, and instead just give you a heads up that your fear levels are getting too high, and I don't think I necessarily believe that, but I do think the vocal majority pressured them into making a change that I don't really feel was needed. And the next thing is the inclusion of speaking lines for Tazzy. So I also saw a lot of people were having problems with Tazzy speaking, which I guess was completely breaking their immersion. And I literally don't get this one either. I mean, sure, silence can be scary, and if your character is just spouting off lines and making jokes during tense situations, it can be detrimental. But that just isn't the case here. Amnesia Rebirth is much more narrative driven, and the story is very personal to Tazzy. I think the choice to give her a voice allows you to relate and understand her character on a deeper level, which will then in turn give more meaning to other aspects of the game. I think anyone saying this game is trying to be woke by having a pregnant female protagonist that speaks is an absolute fool. Was there also this discussion with Alien Isolation, another one of the best horror games of all time? What I see is that the developers had a vision for their story and felt the connection and emotions they wanted the player to feel could only be brought across with a fleshed out character. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, whether or not you actually did connect with her is a different story. Like I said, I wasn't feeling so great about that unholy baby, so a lot of the impact at the end of the story was lost on me because I wasn't really invested in the relationship between Tazzy and Amari. That's why at the end of the 7-hour campaign, I dropped the tower on her. The last thing I have to say about Rebirth is that it's bringing back support for custom stories, and honestly, I couldn't be more excited. I'm not exactly sure what improvements have been made to the HPL engine since the Dark Descent, but after 10 years, I'm assuming the tools will become easier to pick up and use, so I really hope we see another large community of modders coming out with their own custom stories very soon. So Amnesia Rebirth isn't the perfect sequel to the Dark Descent people were hoping for, but despite its shortcomings, I think this is a step forward for the series. In fact, I think if I were to disregard the nostalgia boner I have for the Dark Descent, then Rebirth probably would have taken the crown as the best overall game in the series. It doesn't quite bring the same level of horror that the original Amnesia did 10 years ago, and the game does look a bit dated in some areas, but I had a lot of fun with my first playthrough, and now the unskippable memories are fixed, I'm probably going to go ahead and start a second. And even beyond that, I'm looking forward to spending plenty of late nights checking out the custom stories you all end up making. If you're a fan of the series, I would implore you to give the game a real chance. Get past the slow start, and there's a lot to really like about Rebirth. And that's it for Amnesia for now. I have a feeling Rebirth won't be the end of the series, and hopefully this time we won't have to wait almost a decade to get a new entry. But one thing I will say that I really want to see in a new entry is more experimentation with ways to tell a compelling story and deliver a great horror experience. Again, I have to bring up Alien Isolation, which is top of its class in both of those fields. After playing through all these games between 2 weekends, it really stands out to me how little has changed in a decade. Like I said, Rebirth has some great ideas, but it still has the feeling of every other Frictional game going all the way back to Penumbra Overture in 2007. I think they're really comfortable in the way they make games, but it ends up making their games feel like they're lagging years behind other modern experiences. Their method of storytelling through exposition dumps is dated. Their puzzle hub structure is dated. Honestly, I think the HPL engine has a lot to do with it. I don't think it's anywhere near the level of other modern engines, but it's very scoped down for the specific games Frictional makes. At some point, if you're using the same game design philosophies year after year, each new game will really only be able to stand up based on things unique to it, like setting and story. Soma had an amazing setting and an amazing story, so it was a big winner. And then Rebirth unfortunately isn't as strong in either category, and it really suffers. And it's really just my opinion, but I think that Frictional is not going to be able to get away with staying in their comfort zone for much longer. So overall, taking a look back at the Amnesia series as a whole, I've got to say it deserves to be up there with some of the most iconic horror games. No matter your opinion on any of these games, it's undeniable that Amnesia has made its mark not only on spooky history, but also indie games in general. It's been so influential, helping pave the way for so many indie horror titles over the last decade. Like I said at the start, I love this series, and I think all the games have their own strengths and weaknesses. None of them are perfect, but if you're ever looking for a fun game to play with friends during the spooky season, or even if you just want to prove to yourself that you're a little braver than you thought, you can do a whole lot worse than Amnesia.